pleasure to welcome to our 2024 Online Trend Summit long-term collaborator and friend of the Food People, Amelia Boothman. Amelia brings her specialism in social science and psychology and semiotics to really help us understand the cultural forces and consumer trends to inform and inspire both innovation strategy, product strategy, brand strategy. And it's a great pleasure to welcome Shakufa Hijazi, the Food People's Head of Insight. Welcome, Amelia and Shakufa. It's great to have you both here.
Thanks, Charles. It's lovely to be back again.
Yeah, so good to be here and see you both.
Amelia's going to bring to life the cultural driving forces and that more human narrative behind the top trends for 25-26. And as we go through them, Shakufa and I will help unpack those trends in more detail by asking you a few questions, Amelia, if that's okay as we run through.
Yeah, that'd be great.
If you're participating in today's session as a Trend Hub Enterprise subscriber, you can immerse in the detail behind this keynote and with the additional supporting presentations and videos in the 25-26 social and cultural trend predictions on Trend Hub. So, Amelia, let's unpack some of these super exciting driving forces that are really at the root of our food and drink trend manifestations as we move into 25-26.
Super. Thanks, Charles. So first of all, let's have a little look at how we go about creating our social and cultural trends, and maybe starting off with that first question of why are we bothering? Why are cultural and macro trends important? And really, it's all about the context. Context is everything. And we need to understand the why behind the trends to ensure that we deliver them in a way which subconsciously makes sense and fits each brand story. And if we don't get that context right, the messages can often kind of jar, seem like they're copycatting, or just cue the wrong experience. And I really like this example here we see in the taco world, where the one on the left is a very accessible taco, one you could make at home, one you might have in a kind of fast food type restaurant. And then the one in the middle is perhaps what we might call a sort of masstige experience. You might see people like Oaxaca's delivering something like this. So it's a higher price point, but it's still relatively accessible. And the next one is a sort of premium example of how you can treat a taco. And all of these are so different. And the experience will be different, the decor, the communications, the menu, the language, you name it. So that's what we're trying to unpack here with the social and cultural trends is how to cue these different experiences. And often I'm asked, how do you identify these? Is it a bit woo-woo? And it's not woo-woo at all. We actually use what we call the science of social anthropology, or semiotics is quite a commonly used term, but it's a very specific type of use of semiotics, the study of the signs, codes, and symbols, and the emotional themes in the food and drinks trends, and what's driving them, what's happening in society that's making people act and behave this way and want these different types of foods or twists on what we've had before. And then that makes the trends feel really relevant and potent, and also enables you to work with them. And here we can see how it all fits together. And every year, of course, we have our wheel, and we really like to use the wheel because it enables us to see how they all fit together, and how they're all interconnected and adjacent to each other. And we love this wheel because it really makes it easier for us to digest, explains their relationship, and it can show then these cultural driving forces underneath the four macro cultural trends. So it all fits together essentially. And here we have an example of the cultural trends map. And beneath each of those ones we're going to chat about today, we've got all of the driving forces that, as you say, we can look up on Trend Hub, should we need to. Yeah. But without further ado, let's start at the middle, the most exciting bit, that sort of denouement of what it all means if we bring it together. And this year, the core of our wheel is all about finding balance. And this is about returning a balance and an equilibrium to our lives and society and how we live. And we're trying to break down some of the historic status quos and conventions to create a more thoughtful and mindful way of living. This might be through making sure that when we spend, it's really worth it. We're refinding joy in simple little things, but also making sure we're coexisting quite meaningfully, moving from just being consumers back to being more of a citizen beyond consumerism, if you like. And we're going to talk about a little bit about that in a moment, because I think that's a really exciting concept. And we're seeing that in cultures and societies across the globe right now. And alongside that, we've got this element of keeping it real, making sure that things are not carried out in our name, that we're not happy to have carried out. And finally, choosing how to live our lives in a way that is wiser, living more wisely, not feeling like we have to do everything, consume everything. And we love this concept. We've talked about this in our brainstorms, haven't we? The joy of missing out, or JOMO, which I just think is a lovely way to see that citizenship progress and how it's manifested. So yeah, here's the first part of our journey, the centre, the core of our wheel.
Brilliant. Amelia, if I may, just hearing you speak there, it sort of provoked a thought with me. And obviously we've been on this journey over the last few years, from a progression from under pressure, that sort of rabbit in headlights, what on earth's happening to the world. The last year it was more adapt to thrive and sort of adapting to prosper, and now we're moving into places you've just described of finding balance. How do you see that progression through those different stages?
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? And I don't think there's a time I've been doing this where we've had so many specific strong pressures, such as COVID, obviously Ukraine, the cost of living crisis, all sorts of big pressures going on. And it's been like we've almost been in a state of constant evolving emergencies, if you like. We'll just get through this and then we'll go back to normal. And I think what we've realized now is that old normal isn't really around anymore. And we've got to find a new way of living. And that's how we've progressed from the sort of adapting to thrive previously and before that under pressure, to now this balance where we're sort of taking back control and creating this new equilibrium that feels like it's the world we can now coexist in a way that's acceptable. And previously, I think we've been quite short-termist, whereas now this sort of citizenship theme is about building more of a future rather than just reacting. So this shift in understanding of our reality and reclaiming our new world is really exciting. Recalibrating perhaps our sense of self, which is what we need to do the JOMO, instead of being, yes, we can consume this, we can afford that, we can experience this. Actually saying I'm the kind of person that doesn't need to do everything anymore is quite an interesting shift. And feeling like we can be satisfied with less, which is quite a big jump, really, because most people identify, we've got a bit of this coming up as well, use objects, places, the home to sort of represent themselves. So you sort of have to readjust what that looks like inside and therefore what you want to portray outside. But it's great because we're then going to have this more sustainable behavior, but also taking care of our mental health as a benefit to that, which is a nice shift. JOMO actually being quite good for helping our souls and our mental health. And again, we'll touch upon this very shortly. But yeah, very interesting shifts, aren't they?
They absolutely are. And this notion of being a good citizen feels like it has the foundations of an era that can adapt to what undoubtedly will be a roller coaster. Maybe the peaks and troughs won't be as big as we've experienced over the last few years, but it's a natural evolution, and that sort of notion feels like it will endure the test of time.
Yeah, exactly.
Which I guess segues really nicely into the first of those cultural forces.
Yeah, exactly. Just what I was thinking, which is eat happy. The really, really interesting that two big things come together here. The idea of sort of indulgence and fun and joy, but also self-love, thinking about your mind and your soul, to overcome modern difficulties. And we're sort of combining two needs here because both of them are feeding into this way of being and being healthier and happier with that, but also knowing how to keep it light when there is a world with lots of struggle going on as well, and delivering that indulgence and fun. And we see this coming through again with lots of counterintuitive uses of the senses and flavors, as we've seen before, but it's sort of ratcheted up again. And we've got some quite fun examples to show you. But these two elements of the yin and the yang of kind of looking after yourself, but also indulging, coming together here.
One question, if I might jump in, Amelia, that I had. I mean, I love the feelings that this evokes around food being around, like centered so much around indulgence and joy. I guess one question I have is, isn't that a bit of a forever trend? Isn't food always a source of joy? And if it's not, if it feels more prescient now, look, what is it about the time that we're living in right now that makes food as a sort of source of healing or therapy even more important?
And it's a really good point, because I was aware of food being very important to mental health when I was doing my experimental psychology degree way back when. We've actually had evidence of healthy diet being really important for mental health for some time now. But what we haven't had is the specific evidence that we're now getting. And that's really hitting the mainstream. Historically, actually, culture knew this. And when we look back in social anthropology, tribes would have used different foods to heal both psychologically as well as physically. And it's like we lost touch of that. And it's partly because if we couldn't prove it with science, we didn't believe it. Whereas, of course, pre-science, Renaissance times, we believed in the witch doctor world because something seemed to happen. We just didn't quite have the experiment to prove it. And in fact, what's also really interesting is there's been studies over the last 25 years that have proven how behavior changes and happiness changes. For example, there's been a lot of prison experiments. I remember these when I was doing my psychology degree, where you can reduce the incidence of violence by, on average, 30% in prisons by feeding them good quality food. You make them happier and less anger. And there's been studies about self-harm, and schools, if you give them healthier food, children behave better in the schools. I mean, it's really, really exciting that we're now grasping this, but a shame that, it's taken so long for us to really focus on that. And also, there's been a really recent study about people who are long-term depressed, clinically depressed. They had 3 different cohorts in this trial. One had a normal, healthy, balanced diet according to government guidelines. One were on their antidepressant drugs, and one were given the Mediterranean diet, the proper Mediterranean diet, by the way, not pizza and pasta, but, whole grains, fish, veg, oils, nuts, seeds, that kind of stuff. And the ones given the Mediterranean diet performed better than those on medication. Actually, many of them didn't have to go back to their medication after the diet. That's so exciting. But what it's also meant is this discipline of nutritional psychology, which didn't really exist 30 years ago when I was doing my degree, almost unheard of, is really exploding in interest and strength now as we're realizing that we can eat ourselves happy. And we're seeing mainstream scientists now exploring nootropics such as CBD, magic mushrooms, and discussing these in a way that really would have put them out of their sort of society cohort of fellow scientists as being a bit lost it. Now people understand actually there's really something going on here. And we've seen some really good examples in the food data that you've collected. I think there was one, was it hot dumpling broths in the US was really exciting as a sort of healthy eating, but also comforting, joyful food. I really like one. You probably know some others, but yeah.
Yeah, no, we've actually been seeing a lot of what we call kind of comfort bowls come through because of exactly that. It's sort of, it takes it to that root of, you're not just feeding your stomach, you're feeding your soul, and looking to things like, dumpling soup or a lovely savory congee or whatever it is that just really puts a smile on your face and nourishes the soul as well as the body, that feels sort of more important than ever for a lot of people, especially because, you know, that 5 minutes you take to enjoy that soup, you know, might be the only 5 minutes you get to transport you from your troubles that day.
Fabulous.
And not to bombard you with questions, Amelia, but it's just made me think, actually, just hearing you talk then, this sort of collision of mind and soul, and a key part of that, you also talked about indulgence all in the same sentence, and a key part of, I think, of indulgence are around those food experiences and flavors. And in, you know, when we talk about our top 10 trends, and in the presentation and the discussion I'm going to have with Shakufa about cuisines and ingredients, you know, we see generally more extraordinary boundary pushing flavors continue to rise. We see an increased prominence of those in different dishes and combinations and presence in many different cuisines. It just leads me to ask, why do you think that is? Why is that, you know, growing in its prominence?
And it makes perfect sense, because flavors are sort of essential to the human experience. It's part of those five, or it's actually more than five senses, it's more like 9 or 10. We won't go into that. Weird things like acceleration, deceleration are also seen as senses, hot and cold. But flavor is really fundamental to human experience. And in our world of sort of dopamine addiction and individualism, this really just exacerbates this desire for the next sensory hit, if you like, to keep us engaged. Also, mindfulness is being embraced as an antidote to this constantly overstimulating dopamine kind of world. And mindfulness is a way to sort of really respect and enjoy the flavors, really taking your time to experience the food and think about it. So they're talking now about it's also very good for your not eating too much, to switch off all of the television and the other screens and just focus on the food. And if you have that extreme flavor experience, it just heightens all of that. The more intense and unusual, the more stimulating it is. So it's 1 + 1 = 3 or 4 to help us really enjoy those flavors. So you see things like savory and other unusual combinations continuing to be sought out, and the chefs looking for the next thing that nobody's thought of. I was looking on your examples of white chocolate mousse with foie gras, and I thought, actually, yes, I can really imagine that working. I think that was in the US, but you've probably got some other more amazing examples out there.
Yeah, great example there of sweet and savory combining together, and vice versa, and many different permutations of that. I know we're going to talk about that in other presentations, which I guess leads us really nicely into our next mega theme, Amelia, if that's okay.
Yes, so that takes us to smart spends. And unsurprisingly, in a cost of living crisis, we are still looking to spend more wisely. When did this not happen in our trends world? But we really are making sure we're getting the most for our money. We're getting even more savvy at that, wanting innovations that save us real time or deliver real quality, or new end benefits, or yes, please, can I have all three of those, is even better. And of course, as food producers are getting more sophisticated, that's becoming more and more possible. And so we're finding more premium fast food, fast fine dining, and then extraordinary simplicity going the other way. And we're seeing this also being brought into home as well as out of home, so you can create more cost-effective but equal experiences in your safe space, now that we like to stay at home more and we've made home our castle since those COVID years.
Amelia, I heard you use the word fast a few times there, and that does really seem to be a recurring theme. You know, in all of our research, we come across topics like time poverty a lot. You know, people use phrases like the new normal and convenience. being king again. I guess a question I have is, how are people embracing this in that sanctum of their home, that safe space of theirs, beyond the sort of usual fast food conveniences that we've seen over the years?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting, isn't it? Because obviously we've been talked about being time squeezed for a long time. And we're really seeing that in OECD countries, people are in what they're now calling time poverty. So squeezed beyond the point of they feel they have no free time whatsoever. And in fact, we're seeing quite an interesting rise that we've probably all heard about, such as the rise in ADHD diagnoses, and multiple distractions, social media obviously being a common example of that. So people are feeling that time pressure in a way that they're ping-ponging from one activity to the other without being able to focus. So we really do need these techniques to help us adjust and manage time better and cope with these dimensions. And foods, therefore, that feel like they're offering quality, but in a really easy to access and speedy, convenient way are what they're looking for. And the difference being, the big difference being that I feel like I can access the higher quality items. Often fast means poor quality. And there's been that sort of direct relationship. The faster it gets, the lower the quality. And I think we're now seeing that that doesn't have to be the case. I often think it sort of started with the rise of street food quality, where, you know, you could just walk up to a stand and someone's really specializing in the best Spanish paella or something like that. But now being brought to you, or you being able to do it at home. And one of the examples I was reading on the hub was Malaysia's Meals in Minutes, which is quite interesting, but also drone delivery now enabling this to be much faster yet more efficient. As just some examples of what our new utopian vision is beginning to look like.
Absolutely. And I definitely agree that, fast can be equally as good as slow sometimes, especially if you look at all the innovation in the frozen and ambient aisles too.
Yeah.
Well, also it makes me think of Amrita from Wonder, who's going to be presenting later in the Trend Summit agenda, who's going to be talking about their new US-based concept, which is really reinventing the dine-in and dine at home scene. I'll let her talk more about that later on, but in essence, it's all about fine fast. So exactly to this point. Shakufa mentioned there about reoccurring phrases or words, and I'd noted that in not just in you bringing to life smart spends, Amelia, but also in earlier on in what you were sharing with us, the reference to the word home, and home being sanctuary. You talked about JOMO, and really, I suppose my question is, why are home food solutions becoming more increasingly valued?
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? And we've already talked about this JOMO concept, the joy of missing out, and people sort of choosing to opt out and stay at home where they feel it's their safe space. But also culturally, home has always been really at the center of our identity. When we look back across millennia, people creating these spaces that are about them, and sort of cultural manifestations within the home. When you go around someone's house, you can really see who they are. And it's very much part of their identity. So it's really pushing an open door when you get the home solutions right, because people love being there. We've also seen what the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy calls the Great Resistance, where people are refusing, as we sort of heard anecdotally, to go back to work or back full time, really wanting to stay working from home because of this love of being in this comforting, safe space. And so it's really interesting that that's seen as a trend in the food area, because I think that's just a sort of consequence of that. I've now created my perfect safe space. And if you can help me make that even more perfect. I mean, some of the examples we've got here are things like making your own home kombucha kits, which, you get the kit and then you can just make your kombucha. And of course, that fits with the smart spends, because kombucha is really expensive in the shops when you buy it ready-made. but making it at home is so cheap once you've got the knack, and you do it better than me. I had my kombucha go a bit weird, but I need to try again. But we're seeing a rise in kits that make things, and this makes things feel almost free. I even saw an AI cookbook, which I think is fascinating as well. So there's lots of things that are making home feel quite exciting actually now.
Yeah, most definitely. So if on that note, if I can ask you to introduce our next cultural force, if that's possible.
Yes, and in fact, keeping it real is quite an interesting segue from there.
Yeah.
Because we are seeing people wanting this real honesty and transparency. This has been a trend for a while, and because of things like AI, it's becoming unavoidable because you're going to be caught out because of the way food production works. And so we're really seeing a noble shift towards the greater good of people and planet. And what's super exciting is that sustainability is actually coming of age now. We're developing really good cutting edge technology, which is actually now accepted, affordable, real, and practical. And I think, of course, we're all aware that we've had technologies out there for a while, but have they ever been all these things at once? And we're really seeing that they are. But also, again, with things like AI, we can get real measurable results. So we're not just following an idea of this is going to make the planet a better place. We can actually see it beyond the lip service. So that helps with the greenwashing cynicism we've seen with consumers. And that's what we mean by keeping it real and making it real. And so we're seeing this working with nature, not against it. And the words around regenerative farming is becoming really powerful now and going into the mainstream, whereas really that was a sort of technical farming term before. We even saw Clarkson's Farm picking up on it, which I know is, I believe, Amazon's most successful program of all time. So might feel a bit niche, might feel a bit UK. Actually, no, it's massive. And that's quite interesting that he's choosing to trial techniques in that program, but really looking for things that are delivering the results. So, yeah.
It feels like over the last 4 or 5 years, there's been a much greater focus on not just the food we consume in the moment, but the supply chain, what's led to it getting to onto your plate or into that packet. Much greater focus on crops and things like carbon. How and well, why is that so? Why is there much more focus on production and consumption through that lens of crops and carbon?
Yeah, and I think the social cultural shift that we've really seen is that the climate crisis has been demonstrated really in the last, I mean, we've known about it for decades now, but we've had lots of climatic events, over the last couple of years, which are quite shocking. The floods, the heat waves, they just keep coming, don't they? And we get new temperature records we've never seen before, rain in places it shouldn't rain, like deserts. So it's really obvious now. Hurricane Helen was a really good example that's sort of recently happened. And it's interesting because past cultures historically did follow the seasons and worship the seasons and really respected them. And we lost touch with this when science enabled us to feel all powerful over the planet and like we could control nature. So we lost touch with the idea that it could control us. But now we can't really avoid that. It's really been overturned. And that's given it this momentum that it is really hard to deny it now. And at the same time, science has got practical and usable. So we feel like there's a solution and that we can embrace sustainable options because they don't feel like a sort of pie in the sky dream that wind or solar might be able to heat. We've got more than 50% of our power in many countries now is coming from, renewables. And we see this in the food production as well. And so these concepts are usable and actionable in a time when we feel the fear, and we have the evidence, if you like. So it's sort of going back to understanding and respecting nature. And we see, you know, Coleman's, for example, using regenerative production for their humble mustard seed. AI, I mean, when I looked through all of your different trend manifestations, AI is sort of constantly being used to track the crops, help the crops, work out what's going on, which makes it manageable now, whereas of course it might have been cost prohibitive before, I think.
I think there's also a commerciality to things like regenerative farming, and obviously we've got Wild Farm joining us later in today's session to talk about actually how we take these things like regenerative principles and actually flip those into commercially and sustainable business models, and they're going to be bringing that to life later on.
If I might jump in as well, I think that's also interesting. I would also just add that I think if we're talking about science and sustainability and food security, we've got to talk about the P word, protein or plant-based. You know, we get asked all the time about, you know, what's happening in plant-based, where is it going from here? What's the future of food alts? You know, it's such an integral part of the conversation around sustainability. Amelia, why do you think it evokes so much emotion in people and so much strong feeling? And where do you see it going from here?
Yeah, and there are some really strong feelings out there, aren't there? I mean, you've got companies such as, you know, Beyond Meat, who their stock market price was huge, and then there's been a bit of a wobble now. Was it overpriced? Is it over, this idea of alternatives? But no, because of what we've really seen, it really was perhaps initially overhyped on its stock market price, but it is an honest, credible solution to the problem because it solves two big problems. How do you manufacture popular foods in a way that's sustainable when at the moment it isn't, like the burger, which we know is so popular, and you know, every hotel has to list their burger, every, you know, family favorite restaurant joint, there's a burger on the menu. So how do we deal with the fact that beef is you know, feels less sustainable? And this solves it in a way that's also tasty and people can't tell the difference. We did have the wobble on, is it an ultra processed food? But actually, again, what we're seeing is the latest innovations are much closer to feeling natural, and it can be overcome, and successful companies will be the ones that can deliver the affordable, sustainable, healthy, satisfying product in a transparent way. And that's really where I think the technology is now tipping into. It's delivering all of those things, where, you know, some of the early ones maybe had too many ingredients in and it was a huge list. I was looking at the plant-based sausages crafted from avocado oil, oat bran, whole foods like red bell pepper, spinach, pineapple. I think that was a Beyond Meat one again in America, but I read that list of ingredients and I don't know about you, but I'm not scared by any of those. So I think it's really grasping the nettle and solving the problem now.
I think that's such a good point. And I think, as you say, wherever you sit in the conversation, it's important to keep the conversation going because food security is such an important issue that fundamentally we do need to tackle.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, that's possibly a perfect segue into our next area that we're going to talk about, and also one that's actually going to be illustrated in a conversation that we've got later on in today's session, which is all about sustainable and healthy diet. So, Amelia.
Great. So yes, for the ages, the last of our macro areas. So what we know is happening is we're really beginning to understand our body, and we're now realizing that instead of thinking about each ailment or level of performance as a separate thing, our bodies are really interconnected. Now, we sort of thought they might be, you know, we talked about the gut-brain axis for forever, but now we've got a lot of evidence that they're more connected than we could have possibly imagined. And we're seeing this through the measurement of toxins, ultra-processed foods, and we're also wanting to increase what we're now calling our health span. So not just how long we live, but how long we have this lovely, active, engaged, healthy life. before various diseases or ailments get the best of us. So we want to live these longer, better lives, as of course we all do. But new science breakthroughs are showing how we are what we eat. And that phrase, of course, is timeless, but the evidence hasn't been as strong and clear and present as it is now. So we're looking to transform our systems. And in fact, a number of the sort of recent data analysis studies on this have shown we can even reverse our age. If we've made mistakes or if we've been unhealthy, if we make the shifts, we can actually see our structural age, if you like, reverse back through targeted diets, lifestyle hacks. But it's all about working out who we can trust and who we can listen to. And the scientists we're really seeing as being our sort of gurus. This sort of started in COVID, didn't it? Where the scientists stood up instead of the politicians. It used to be that all the recipe books were written by either celebrities or chefs, but now they're written by, doctors and scientists, professors, you name it. They're the ones that we're all seeking. So yeah, that's the big shift that we're now seeing.
One thing that I've really noticed in the context of this area that you're talking about, Amelia, are phrases like biohacking and targeted nutrition being used more and more. I think especially because, as you say, a lot of the books are now being written not just by cooks, but also scientists, perhaps people who are scientists and cooks. Could you sort of talk us through like why this sort of language is being used more, why it's particularly relevant at the moment?
Yes, so building on the now trusting those scientists, we're seeing from studies, perhaps the most famous one that we hear talked about is the Zoe Health study, who use the homozygous twins cohort at St. Thomas's in collaboration with, I think, at Stanford and Harvard, to test how our bodies respond to foods. And they're very surprised by their results not being about genetics. So identical twins, you should get the same response to foods. They're actually seeing that dependent on the lifestyle of the twins, their responses can be very different because of changes in lifestyle and diet. And so the discipline of epigenetics is now gaining more and more momentum because we realize that we can change our gene expression due to lifestyle. And it's becoming really established with the evidence that we can see with, peer-reviewed clinical research trials that actually a lot of our lifestyle and diet triggers the disease, or not eating these things. They talk about inflammatory foods, don't they? And this personal epigenetic system, if you like, ends up having a response that ages us, or we see differences in genders we didn't understand. Because, of course, most research in the past was done on the male because the females are a bit complicated. We have hormones that are changing all the time and things. So we're much more expensive to research. So let's just do the men. They're simple. Whereas now that we've got these bigger research bodies of data, we can see that actually what gender you are, what age you are, what life stage, if you're pregnant or going through the menopause, or you might have other sort of imbalances that are built into your genetics. And what if I eat a croissant versus if you eat a croissant, I might get a inflammatory sugar spike and you might not, just because we're different. So this intuitively makes sense, actually, because when we look back at social anthropology, tribes always did this anyway. They treated people differently. They had different age grades and things like that, where the witch doctors would give them different remedies on the basis of that. So it's not entirely counterintuitive to us that we can treat ourselves differently. And we're seeing lots of things like health powders defining themselves by life stage and such like as a result.
Essentially, one size does not fit all.
Definitely not. And the science proves it.
A question, if I may. I suppose it's a bit of an obvious one, really, but I'd really just like to explore it and sort of spell it out, I suppose, in a little bit more detail. It feels like we're becoming much more mindful and probably precise, actually, about what we put into our bodies and the characteristics and the values and the benefits of those foods. We're much more aware than we've ever been before. But from your point of view, why is this happening? And I think you've planted some seeds to that as you've gone through what you've shared so far. But I think just to spell it out to the audience, I think it's super helpful.
Yeah, and I think it's really just it is a build on this fact that we've got the evidence. And for years, I've been running focus groups, as well as doing the semiotic analysis with people on how they choose foods, their behavior towards health. And people have been saying things like everything in moderation, and also the research changes. They tell you one thing in the Daily Mail one week and the next thing in the Washington Post the other week. So it's so inconsistent, I don't know what to do. So I'm just going to eat everything in moderation, balanced diet. Until now, where we do have these peer review studies, and particularly we're seeing this issue with ultra processed food coming up. Another shift that I've seen in consumers' understanding is they use the language ultra processed food, and that's really only happened in the last, I'm going to say year, perhaps 18 months at the most. And I've just been doing some transatlantic research where we've literally seen that happen again just in the last few weeks, where that language is coming up. They don't necessarily understand what exactly an ultra processed food is yet, but they're beginning to get an idea. It's about things that my grandmother or great grandmother, depending on how old you are, wouldn't recognize. So words and language that doesn't sound like food. And it's also not having too many artificial ingredients, and things that they just don't understand what they are. So they're beginning to get this idea of minimally processed to ultra processed, but where the lines are drawn and the boundaries are a bit fuzzy still. But it's interesting because also the stock market is beginning to have rumblings of downgrading companies that have too much ultra processed food in their portfolio, and companies are therefore busily trying to deal with that, so that they can keep the consumers happy. Because of course, like we've been saying on some of the other pages of the trends, is that there is choice now, and companies can get around this. And we were just talking about that with the Beyond Meat. You don't have to put all those things in. We've got methods that mean that we can more cleanly do it, so we don't create inflammation and trigger our genes in that epigenetic way that we were just talking about. And that's creating these great shifts. We even see, we've seen it for a while, this lower alcohol intake, for example, because we know alcohol is inflammatory. And of course, if you've got a Fitbit on your wrist and you look at your heart rate variability in the morning because you're quite interested in maybe sports and performance, if it's plummeted because you went on the Raz last night on the booze, you're going to think twice before you do that again. Is it worth it? So I think that's what's really happening as we can monitor our body's response to all of these foods. And yeah, it's fascinating seeing that shift, isn't it? It's very exciting, watching people rethink about their ingredients. And some of the examples are great that you guys have got: the lower sodium green siliconia salt, and people like Biona pesto, where it's really minimal ingredients. Pesto made like hopefully Nonna in Italy would have made 100 years ago, is the sort of utopian vision. And when you watch those programs on the green zones, that's essentially what they're doing, aren't they?
Yeah exactly. No, super, thanks for bringing that to life in a little more detail. That's super helpful, thank you.
So I guess just to sort of wrap up, therefore, after we've done our 4 main areas, is just to look at that, how it's sitting across the cultural to food and beverage trends. And we've sort of hinted at that, haven't we, with the examples that fit underneath these drivers. And you can see there's been a real balance of push and pull factors as we've been talking, which is really how the brain psychology works. It's the carrot and the stick. It's the live that longer, healthier span. It's the fear of getting ill, etc. And we see that played out across the trends fitting together there. I'm also often asked how do you actually use these? Are they just abstract concepts, and what's the point of doing them? And they're particularly useful if you're looking to innovate. They're the why in your workshops or brainstorms, because they're going to help you to decode the reason why it might be growing or shrinking and how it might relate to you and your brand. And that really helps with the platforms and development of your brand to sort of drive brand growth. Because if you get the right stories and the right cultural context, then when you introduce your new product, it will be really clear as to how it fits in their lives and the why they should do want to buy it.
And hopefully engage at a deeper, more meaningful level as well.
Yeah, exactly. And so that leads us to sort of just summing it up here as to how it all fits together in the wheel and on the Trend Hub.
Amelia, that is absolutely brilliant. I mean, thank you so much for sharing your anecdotal insight and that sort of the human narrative and the meaning behind, as we started at the beginning, that notion of finding balance that sits at the center of that wheel, and then eat happy and smart spends and keeping it real and for the ages. It's super helpful to delve into that detail. So as you say, so we can understand the why, so that everybody watching and engaging with this content can develop products, systems, services that can engage with users, consumers at a deeper, more engaging and emotional level. So thank you. It's been our great pleasure to welcome you, Amelia. Thank you, Shakufa, for joining me today and asking some of those provocative questions to Amelia. It's a pleasure to have you both join us as part of our 2024 Online Trend Summit. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.